Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. So, those things that people rarely come out to discuss them. It is few people that have heard them coming out to talk about this. Now, what do I mean? There's this pastor that maybe I'll disclose his name or the link to the channel to my description, and he unravels or exposes a lot of things which are really, really critical to especially Christians or a person who consider them a Christian. Now, what am I saying? It's so wrong to find a situation where during those times a black person was being hindered not to get to the church. When finally they have reached to the church door, they're not being allowed to get into the church. That's how racism in churches were in the past. That's just a prelude of of one of the things in which this preacher is talking about. And in this interview, he exposes how white people were, racist in church, because he's a white preacher, and during his 20s he experienced this, and it is just decided to reform, change his ways, and now he's here to preach the truth. And I'm glad, because this discussion is really, really getting better day and day. And when the discussion is getting better day and day, it means that people are doing better in terms of behavior, of how they do things, of how they presume things, because you can't tell me that there is a thick line between racism and Christianity. There is so big difference. There is so big difference, because even the Bible itself, it's against discrimination, and we should not be discriminated based on your skin color, because the teachings and everything doesn't allow that. But again, there is so much deep to talk into. So I want us to, generally, let's have a look at this video, and you'll learn a lot of things from this preacher. That's one thing that I'm gonna promise you. You are going to learn a lot of things, and even a number of things that you never knew that happened in white churches some times ago, or maybe some are still happening today and people are not talking. So I want us to watch this video. Let's just watch this video and then come back, have a proper discussion. I might interrupt in the middle of the video, but again, let's watch the video and then come back, have a proper discussion about this issue. How do we draw a thick line between Christianity and racism in church? So let's get into it.
So I met with Robbie a few days ago, and we talked about some questions that I might like to ask him, and he also introduced me to some research that he's done on critical race theory. So in combination with the books that he's written, I'm going to ask him about critical race theory as well. So my first question that I would like to ask him is to have him talk about his personal experiences growing up in a predominantly white Baptist church, and the white supremacy in the congregation in which he grew up, and how it was the norm at that time, because I think that has shaped much of his research and what he is doing today. So can you talk about that experience?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see actual live human beings, that you're not in these little boxes.
Yes.
As I'm staring out at you, although some of you, I realize I am staring out at you through little boxes. I'm happy you're here as well. But I'm happy to be here. So I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up predominantly in Mississippi at a Southern Baptist church on the working class side of town, segregated white side of town in Jackson, Mississippi. A little bit before I tell you some. My family goes way back, though. We are Baptists all the way into the early 1800s. In fact, one of the things that I have in my possession is, and one of my more prized possessions, is a family Bible from 1815. It's been passed down on my mother's side from mother to daughter, actually, and she passed it on to me when I went to seminary just up the road in Fort Worth at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. In that Bible, I think is actually a good place to start, because on the one hand, it's a Bible, right? So it comes down as this religious symbol down through my family. And in that Bible, many of you may have one of these, this like old Bible, and in between the Old and New Testaments, there are these family history pages, right, where marriages, births, deaths for generations are written there, starting the earliest date in that Bible, even though it was printed in 1815. They went back a little bit. 1799 is the first kind of birth listed in the Bible, and it goes down several generations for that. That ancestor of mine was named Pleasant Moon. It's a British name, actually, and it's male. So Pleasant is male and Moon is British. So that's really what I knew. And as I was doing research for this book, I discovered that another document also from 1815, and that was from his uncle, for whom he was named, also Pleasant Moon, and it was his estate, the settlement of his estate that I found in the Georgia archives. And as I was looking through that document, it lists all the things fascinating: one bay mare, one feather bed, one spinning wheel, 6 head of sheep, like that kind of thing there. But listed among all of those household items were 4 human beings. Right? And name by name, it was one Negro woman named Naomi at $850. One bird, a boy, at $150. Like those kinds of things named out in that ledger. And when I think as I was struggling with this, it was this really the project journey I've been on the last 5 years, particularly, was really holding these two things in my hand at the same time, right? Which I began to feel actually began to have equal weight. The single sheet of paper and this kind of Bible, right? And that Bible includes pastors, Baptist preachers in Georgia, Dexter Memorial Baptist, my ancestors was the founding pastor there, etc. And yet sometimes these people were the same people. Baptist preachers, devout Baptist lay people, owning, enslaving other people on the basis of their skin, the color of their skin. And my colleague Steve Dominy is here. Shout out to Steve, who was with me at Southwestern. But it wasn't until I landed at Southwestern Seminary that I understood and was taught the real beginnings of what the words what the word Southern and Southern Baptist meant. Right? And it was in 1845, Baptists in the South split with Baptists in the North over the issue of whether someone who enslaved other people could be appointed as a missionary. Baptists in the South decided that was fine. Baptists in the North said they wouldn't appoint them. And so this entire enterprise got off the ground, right, in 1845. And the thing I'd also not realize is that the political secession that ripped the country apart in the Civil War had its dress rehearsal in Baptist and Methodist churches, right? There was a religious secessionist movement based on the same things inside Methodist and Baptist churches, Methodists also split 1845, that really paved the way for the political secession movement over the same issue. So I think, that history and kind of wrestling with that, like I said, I went to Baptist college, went to Baptist seminary. I was also that kid that was at church 5 days a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night was visitation, Tuesday night was Bible study, Wednesday night was spaghetti supper in the gym and youth group. I mean, that was kind of my life growing up. And yet, the way that to get to your question, the way that white supremacy, I think, exerted itself there is that I don't remember a single sermon about racial injustice. I don't remember anything like that. And the one event I do remember, the two times African Americans came into our sanctuary. I only remember 2. One of them was a person who was convicted of grand theft larceny and was serving time at Parchman Prison, and was invited into our church to sing. But while he was incarcerated, which means he came in his prison clothes, and there was an armed white guard sitting at the back of the church as this African-American man came to sing for our white church. That was one time. The only other time I remember is when a friend of mine got invited to a lock-in. So maybe you are Baptist and know that word probably, where the youth kind of have this overnight thing in the gym and come to church on Saturday night, come to church on Sunday morning. African-American friend of ours got invited, came to that, and the thing we were doing Sunday morning was the youth were singing in the choir, right? And so here we are arrayed up behind the pulpit in the choir loft, and there's this black face sitting staring at this all-white congregation. Our friends, we actually didn't think anything of it. That afternoon, there was an emergency deacons meeting called to figure out what to do if he or his family wanted to come and join the church. Like it precipitated an emergency deacons meeting to try to figure, because we had an official closed door policy, as most white Baptist churches did. And then I think one other quick story, this kind of generation back, but it wasn't until I was working on this book that I found out that that one of the roles that my grandfather served as a deacon in East Macon Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, was that one of his official roles as a deacon, they took turns doing this, was to stand on the outside steps of the church and to prevent any black people from coming to church, right? To stop them before they got, he was essentially a bouncer, outside the church to stop any non-white person from entering the sanctuary. And that was a regular occurrence. And in fact, Medgar Evers, the Jackson, Mississippi-based civil rights organizer, what's not written a lot about him is that the thing he was doing the day before he was killed was trying to integrate white churches in Mississippi, First Baptist Church and Galloway Memorial Methodist Church in downtown Mississippi, where the governor and the mayor respectively went to church, right? And that was the thing he was killed for. And by the way, who was he killed by? He was killed by an Episcopalian, a white man who was from the Delta, in good standing in an Episcopalian church, who had also played that role of standing out on the steps of his church to prevent any black people from coming to church. That's the man who pulled the trigger.
So what made you decide that you wanted to be different after growing up in this type of church? And what made you so courageous and brave?
Yeah, I don't really think of it that way, I have to say. It's been a long, embarrassingly long journey. So like I said, I was in my 20s when in seminary, where I first got the straight story about the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm 53, right? So it's been a 30-year journey. I'm still learning stuff. Like on the plane coming up here, or down here from DC, I've been reading about Emmett Till and just educating myself. If you had asked me who Emmett Till was, or Medgar Evers for that matter, when I graduated high school, and I graduated at the top of my class in high school, 2 Mississippi history courses, I would have had no idea who those people were. I had just no idea. And so I'm still on this kind of re-education process of kind of learning. And I will credit my parents. I think one of the things that happened, in terms of how does this happen, at least in my family, one of the things that happened is that my parents decided to be the ones to say, we're going to draw a little bit of a line and a barrier between the kind of just rampant Jim Crow. They grew up in Jim Crow, Macon, Georgia, right? Everything was segregated. Theaters segregated, train stations segregated, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, when they had kids, decided they were not going to allow the N-word to be thrown around at my grandparents' house. In fact, had to be quite forceful about that. And I think provided just enough room there for us to have some critical distance from it. And then I think just, hopefully it's some growth, a little bit of growth along the way. But at the end of the day, I think the challenge for us is just trying to tell the truth, right, about who we are, where we come from, and where we've been, and how that's contributed to, what James Baldwin called the racial nightmare, right, that America is still living in.
Okay, thank you. So my second question, in White, Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, it contains many anecdotes and quotes describing ministers, bishops, and lay people being involved in mobs and lynchings and celebrating them in church. Talk about how they rationalized this behavior and thought it was okay for Christians to behave this way. How were they able to rationalize this behavior, in your opinion?
Yeah, it was a complex question. So I did a little bit. I basically followed my family's journey: Mississippi, Atlanta, and Georgia. There's one horrific lynching in Georgia where what struck me is that the lynching was attended by churchgoers from Atlanta. Right, so word got out. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution published that there was going to be this lynching, and there were so many people. It was on a Sunday, and there were so many people coming from churches. They had to, the Atlanta terminus of the railroad had to put special trains together to carry the number of people going from Atlanta to Noonan. Right, and that picked up as churches let out. People poured from the churches to the train station, men, women, children, in their Sunday clothes. And the conductors were shouting things like, "This way to the burning." right, as they were piling people onto cars there. When you read accounts of it, it has accounts. If you didn't know what was happening and you just read the quotes that reporters were writing coming from the crowd as this man was being tortured and killed, Samuel Wilkes is his name, you would think you read a revival meeting. Things like "Glory, glory be to God" were being shouted, from this very religious, very Christian crowd as this human being is being tortured and killed. There's this sense that the sense of revival took over in the spirit of the crowd. It's quite disturbing to see that. And then to Martin Luther King's, then if you ask, for example, what gets preached the Sunday after events like that, mostly nothing. Having to do with anything, right? It's business as usual back in churches on the Sunday after the event. The Sunday after the Tulsa Race Massacre, the centennial just got celebrated last year. There's actually a record of a Methodist bishop that actually did preach the following Sunday after 300 plus African Americans have been killed by roving bands of their white neighbors in Tulsa. And he takes the pulpit at the tallest steeple Methodist church. It's where all the civic leaders go. It's a very wealthy church. And he basically blames it on the African Americans, right, and the crowd. And that he concludes by saying the answer to all of this is that we bring more people to Christ, right? That's the kind of platitudinous kind of sign at the end. So it all gets turned into this kind of individualism this kind of mystical relationship with Jesus that has nothing to do with the violence and the injustice, outside.
Do you think we see this victim blaming today with police brutality?
Well, it's been, I was, like maybe you watched, as the reaction to Black Lives Matter in many conservative white Christian circles was all lives matter, right? Blue lives matter. This kind of reaction to that and this sense of not being able to kind of even comprehend what was going on. I think some of it just willful pushback. But I think a lot of it is that we have just been, this theme is do we want to heal, right? And I think many of us have been giving a resounding no to that question, right? And that what we have been able to say is no, actually we're fine, right? Despite this history, despite the fact that our theology, our liturgy, our hymns, for example. I grew up with the Broadman hymnal, right? Many of you may have, you're in Baptist world. There's still Broadman Press in the Southern Baptist Convention. The word Broadman comes from two people, John Broadus, Basil Manley. Broad man, right? John Broadus, one of the founders of Southern Seminary, the first kind of Baptist seminary, who called himself an ultra pro-slavery man, right? And had a lot of money from enslaving people. He himself on human beings. Basil Manley was well known as the chaplain of the Confederacy. Basil Manley Sr. was actually the first founding president of the board at Southern Seminary. He was the man who held the Bible as Jefferson Davis took the oath of office as president of the Confederacy. He was the architect of the move away of the creation of the Southern Baptist Convention as well, right? And so that's still with us today, right? Broad man is these two enslavers, right, who justified enslaving other human beings on the basis of the color of their skin, with Baptist principles and biblical principles.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, so my next question, talk about your research and how white Christians testify they feel warmly toward black and non-white people, but when you look at their viewpoints and look at how, when you ask them questions relating to immigration and treatment of immigrants, and also their viewpoints regarding police and their comfort with the advancement of multiculturalism, their viewpoints usually align. Can you talk about some of your research?
Yeah, I'll do a deeper dive in the talk later this morning on this. So I won't get too much into the numbers, but I'll give you the kind of overall patterns. I've always been interested in things like the Promise Keepers movement and things that attempted these things under the banner of racial reconciliation, right? They were about kind of trying to kind of mend some things. I think there's some things to applaud there, but also some really troubling things. That what they're really after is let's get over it, was a lot of the things. And also I think the way that Baptists and evangelicals have often dealt with racism is as a personal problem of individual hearts, right? Not as a problem built into the structure of our society. Now, that's an insane way to think about racism. It's just a counterfactual way to think about racism. You look at any city in the country of any size, still today, you can, with pretty good accuracy, predict where white and black people live. In those cities, Detroit, Chicago, and it's LA, New York, it's not just Jackson or Dallas, right? It's St. Louis, like all over the place. That's no accident, right? It's not that, black people just decided to live on the south side of Chicago, right? The city had ordinances, laws, real estate brokers, were colluding to not allow people to live outside of certain blocks that were literally drawn on a map called redlining to kind of distinguish like this section for blacks only, this section for whites only. We're still living with that legacy today. I live near Baltimore. There are 2 zip codes in Baltimore that are 3 miles apart. The life expectancy between those 2 zip codes difference is 20 years. If you're born in this zip code, it's predominantly black, your life expectancy is 20 years less than if you're born 3 miles down the road in this zip code. Right? That is the reality we're still living with today. I think we haven't really, come to grips with.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in your talk today. So now I want you to talk a little bit about critical race theory. I read your articles and they were very interesting. First, can you give us a definition of critical race theory and how it has been misconstrued in some of the legislation that we're hearing about today?
Let me finish up one last point on this last question. Okay. I'll get to that. I realize I didn't quite land the plane on the last one. So the thing I do want to say, though, is this thing that we can actually measure in the data is this gap that you mentioned between, if you ask white people in general, but white Christians in particular, how warmly they feel toward African Americans, they score off the charts on that. They report very warm feelings toward African Americans. But one of the things I did in the book is I went and asked a whole range of other questions, though, about racism, about Confederate flags and monuments, about the treatment of African Americans in the criminal justice system, about economic inequalities, et cetera, and across the board, they have very different views on that. So the things I concluded in the book is, and I'll explain it later, but in the next talk, but I had a thing I called the Racism Index, which is a composite measure of all those actual policy, history, systemic racism kinds of questions. And what was stunning is that white evangelicals would score like in the 90s on warmth, right? 90 out of 100 on warmth toward African Americans. They would simultaneously score 80 out of 100 high on the racism index, right? So simultaneously warm feelings and against every possible policy you could put in the scale, against any idea that past discrimination has any effect on the present, denying all of that stuff. So those two things coexist. And I think they coexist for a reason, right? Because there's a way in which if I tell myself, and this is like one of the deep problems I think with white evangelical theology today, if I tell myself that me and white Jesus are okay, right? Nothing else matters. Right, I don't even have to think about the injustice swirling around. Martin Luther King had this great, and we're sitting in this stained glass building here, with a couple of white Jesuses, by the way, in the building that are not accidental. That we have to think about these things. And Martin Luther King said, he asked in dismay in a letter from Birmingham jail when he was thinking about the good white people like us sitting in these churches. He had this just damning phrase. He said, who are these people? Who is the God that they worship sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows? Right, and that phrase, like the anesthetizing stained glass windows, I think is how that has often, our theology, rather than enlivening our sensibilities about the injustices all around us, instead slowly and very very effectively dull them, right? And lure us into this false sense of security that me and white Jesus, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Thank
the other
you.
question is about critical race theory.
Yeah, talk about critical race theory.
All right, so first thing I would say
That's
is
a hot
that
topic.
95% of the time when that term is used, nobody knows what they're talking about. All right, that's the first thing to say about that. What it actually is a kind of academic area of study that's usually used in like second year law school. Like the University of Mississippi, for example, their law school teaches a second year law school course named critical race theory, right? That's taught at the University of Mississippi Law School. That's where that usually exists at that level. It does not really exist anywhere at the elementary school level or middle school level. I mean, it is a graduate level. It's a defined academic field of study. That's what it is. What it has but transformed into is sort of a Rorschach test, right? For anything anybody doesn't like that has to do with racism. Particularly anything white people don't like that has to do with racism. It's sort of like the way communism was thrown around in the 1950s, right? It really is this kind of catch-all bogeyman term for anything related to race or racism that people don't like. But I wrote a thing a few weeks ago where I tried to kind of get to the bottom of it. I looked at the Texas legislation, Florida legislation. There's actually only about a dozen states that do not have critical race theory legislation being introduced. It's really all across the country. They're essentially Frankenstein bills that are cut and pasted from others, so you can just see the same stuff floating around in these bills. But basically, what it comes down to me, the most important thing I think for white Christians to really reflect on is a fundamentally anti-Christian idea at the root of those bills. And that is this, that white people should be comfortable. Like, where in the world would we get the idea as Christians that our goal in life is to be comfortable, and particularly comfortable at other people's expense? Like, where in the Bible are you going to find that, right? And I was thinking more about this. The piece I wrote, I titled "The Sacred Work of White Discomfort." Right, because when I think about it, we think about it at the Baptist tradition, this revivalist tradition. I have both been at and preached in actual tent revival settings, so I know of which I speak. There were, in those settings, there's a bench down front, right? If you study this, and it's either called the mourner's bench or the anxious bench, right? It was a piece of architecture in those revival meetings built in, because the goal of the service was that the Spirit would convict you of sin, right? And when the Spirit convicted you of sin, you made a public display of that. You would come down front. You would go to the anxious bench, and people would scream and yell and wail and cry, right, as they sat there wrestling with being convicted of sin. It was powerful. But it was at the heart of what it meant to be Christians, what it meant to be, first of all, saved. Certainly in the Baptist tradition, you don't get saved without the conviction of sin, right? And that is not a comfortable process, right? If we make white discomfort the measure of all things authentic, we will not be saved, right? According to the way that the gospel functions in the white evangelical world. Like, you won't get to salvation if that's the measure of your life. And even if you get to salvation, the whole idea of discipleship is about constantly, what do we look in the mirror? We're faced with all those, I think of those anguished passages by Paul, right? I do the things I don't want to do. I'm not the man I want to be. Like, it's just, you can feel the discomfort on the page, right? That's right out of the New Testament. And here we are writing bills that, if you read like the Florida bill, I just want to really dissect it, but they're all basically the same. That they literally define, like, there's 8 things that are about like things that might make white people uncomfortable, and then they literally define discrimination. They say these are discrimination is things that cause white discomfort, is literally what it says in the law. It's just nuts. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It's just nuts. So if you just slow it down enough to unpack it, and you get away from that's a scary word when I don't know what it means if I'm white, it really is fundamentally anti-Christian.
Thank you for sharing that. So you end your book by telling stories of change and map out ways in which white Christian Americans can move forward hand in hand with their black brethren. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, and one of the, I guess, most hopeful things I got to do when I was working on the book is I got to hang out at two First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. Now, many towns have two First Baptist churches because of this history. So their history is, and I should say, I got to this church. It's actually the church that's connected to my parents, who both grew up in East Macon Baptist Church, which was a church plant of First Baptist Church. So basically, First Baptist Church decided that the mill workers needed their own church and started that church. That's the church my parents went to. All right, so this is the upper class First Baptist Church. But their history, it was founded in the 1820s, and their history is that there was originally one First Baptist Church, and it was the church that white people brought enslaved people to every Sunday. Right, white people sat in the front. Enslaved people sat in the back. This was very common back then. And then as the Civil War goes, they eventually goes by. Slavery is abolished. They eventually get their own church, first still under the supervision of a white pastor, and then eventually their own independence. And then they sat kind of around the corner from each other. You could see one steeple from the other. You could throw a golf ball from one parking lot to the other. That's how close they are. And there's just a kind of park in between for 150 years, basically ignoring each other. Right, living completely separate lives despite this shared history. And in the mid-19-teens, 2014, the two pastors finally said, like, what are we doing here, right? We've got this history. We never talked to each other, and decided to kind of slowly build a kind of covenanted relationship where they joined together and have been just trying to create community. They're not trying to merge the churches. They're just trying to form community, and it's been quite a moving thing to see. It's been slow, it's been kind of awkward, but I do think it's been a way where the white church it's really changed, I think, particularly the white church, as they've had to come to terms with this relationship. And one of the things, for example, they discovered, the white church did when they started digging back through the history and trying to tell a truer story of themselves, was that at one point in time, the church was in financial straits. They weren't able to pay the pastor's salary, they weren't making the mortgage payment, and they were at risk of losing the church. And as a solution, they sold about a dozen of their own members to balance the books. So they sold enslaved people who were on the rolls as members of the church, because they actually counted those people. So they actually sold members of their own church to balance the books. And you can see it in the ledger, money coming in through the sale of these members, and then money going out to pay the mortgage and pay the pastor. Right, so I think them having to kind of reckon with that history, but also I think coming to a place where I think they're able to, I think that's the healing thing. I think the journey they've been on is actually to heal. Like, why do you go through that, right? Is because you think on the other side of it is health. And if you really understand the kind of distortions, right, and I think that's the thing that's become so clear to me, is that, you know, this history of being first committed to a kind of cultural sense of white supremacy. That was the primary cultural commitment. Everything else had to fit around that commitment, right? So theology, hymnody, liturgy, if you think about like what could be preached in a congregation like that, right? You're not going to preach a lot of Exodus in a congregation where enslaved people are being brought to church, right? You're going to preach a lot of slaves obey your masters, right? You're not going to preach in Christ there's no slave nor free, no Greek nor Jew. That's not going to be on the agenda, right? So I mean, it's distorted our own sense of Christianity. I think that's why I was so happy about the theme of this conference, of do we want to be healed? Because I think a lot of times we think so much. I think it's part of the defensiveness around CRT is the question, so what's it going to cost us at the end of the day, right? But I think white people and white Christians in particular have not really thought about what we've already lost, right? What have we lost by this prior commitment to white supremacy? How has that distorted, disfigured our faith almost beyond recognition, right, to us? And that's what's at stake for us.
Before we take a few questions from the audience, what's next for you? Are you working on a book right now?
Yeah, thanks. I am working on a new book, tentatively called Until Hope and History Rhyme. And it's a look at 4 communities that have been wrestling with the history of racial violence and how they're healing. So it's right on theme. So, like, how does that work? So actually, after this, I'm headed up to Tulsa. And I'm going to be interviewing a bunch of people in Tulsa about their centennial recognition memorial last year of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But what now, right, is the question. So we told the truth, right, about this awful event 100 years ago, but what now? Like, how do we heal, right, once we tell it? Because truth telling is only one piece of this. So that's what's next for me. And then I'm trying to kind of push my own writing along, like this thing on a Substack newsletter that invite all of you to tune in. And it's kind of a community. You can comment, but it's robertpjones.substack.com there. And I'm trying to write weekly there as I have time.
That sounds like a very worthwhile project. I think that's one way that we can heal is by seeing how other people have gone about doing it. So I appreciate that work. Okay, so now at this time, Greg will go around, and if you all have any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Jones, feel free to do so.
Mine is both question to you and to, is this on?
Yes.
And maybe sharing the information with the audience. Are you aware, Robbie, that the division between Northern and Southern Baptists over slavery was specifically over the 2 slave-owning Baptist missionaries who founded Baylor? So we at Baylor carry a very distinct burden for having been the cause of this division, which is one reason I think the administration and current board is taking this so seriously, because we really must. It's a piece of our history we've ignored.
Thank you for sharing that information.
I'll just make a quick comment. One of the real challenges, I think, for older Baptist institutions is that this history is at our core. It's not peripheral. I think that's the challenge of dealing with it, right? We still have almost every Baptist University campus has got this entanglement at one level or another. And the real question is, what do we do? How do we deal with it? Said like these names, Broadman, Manley, Burleson, here on Baylor's campus, they're real things, right? And we've got chaplains of the Confederacy that are still kind of looming, haunting, our campuses. I think it's something that we seriously have to reckon with. And I think it's hard to reckon with when you, like on a campus, and most Baptist campuses are like this, that aren't that diverse, right? And so you've got, a student body that's less than 10% African American, it's and 90% white. White students can kind of walk around and be kind of oblivious about it, right? It's harder to kind of sink in. But I think bringing these things to the surface, dealing with them honestly, and making a real choice to say, like, no, actually, that's not who we are today. It's not who we want to be. It is who we are. And that's one thing that I think we really have to say is I'm not a fan of people's shorthanding. And I think the intention is usually well-meaning, but the shorthand, whenever I hear, oh, this is not who we are, I just want to say, this is absolutely who we are. Right? It is absolutely who we have been. And if we want to be somebody different, we're going to have to do something different, right? We can't just sort of coast.
And the first step is always identifying it. So you have to identify it and you have to take ownership. And so you definitely have to say that that's who we are. And then the next step is taking action.
And just one quick thing on this. I do think I just continually boil it down. If white Christians will just do 2 things, we'll, get there. And that is to tell the truth, tell the whole truth, and love all our neighbors, right? If we can do those 2 things, all the stuff we're talking about, reconciliation, healing, we'll get there, I think. But we've got to tell the truth, and we got to tell all of it. And none of this 2-stepping around it. Just tell the truth, right? It is there. Like these equivocations, Baptists, I think in particular, I actually called it in my book the Baptist 2-step, So you'll appreciate that in Texas, right? I learned a two-step here in Texas, in Fort Worth, with Steve, actually. But this is what we always do, right? Well, like, yeah, those were Confederate monuments, but they weren't put there till the 30s or 40s, right? Not knowing that that's precisely when all the Confederate monuments were put up, right? Because it was when Jim Crow was being defended and lynchings were on the rise, right? That's actually the point in the 30s and 40s, was to kind of put those monuments there. And to sort of like Southern Seminary, like put out this whole report, right, naming people who were involved with slavery. Who did they leave out? Basil Manley Sr., the president of the board, kind of the key architects of Southern Seminary, only gets like this much mention. They focus on the 4 founding faculty members, right? This kind of weird kind of obfuscation so that they can kind of focus on those folks and leave off, like, I mean, the one who was like the architect of the seminary, and the one, like I said, who held the very Bible that Jefferson Davis took the oath of office, prayed this for the Confederacy, prayed this huge flowery prayer about how the Confederacy was God's vision for human society on earth. It was the kingdom of God on earth embodied. And, you know, that's a little too big, right, to deal with. But we got to tell all the truth, right, not just kind of parts of it, and no quick apologies, right? Tell the truth, let's let it sit there, and that's the step on a journey, not the sort of precipice for a quick apology.
Yes, I agree. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done.
Other questions?
Hey, Robbie. I was going to mention that study that Southern did. So even Southern will dig into this history. But the other thing they didn't mention is the theology at root. And I think you accurately described that earlier. Do you see any evidence of a reassessing of theology in these circles that led to this?
Yeah, I do some. I'll say mostly what I see in the official Southern Baptist institutions is doubling down, right? We saw the six. To my knowledge, I don't recall a single other time where the 6 presidents of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries have gotten together on anything, right? But they managed to get together to denounce critical race theory, right? Not poverty, not racism, but critical race theory was the thing that they could get themselves around a table and manage to denounce, right? So I think there's a clear doubling down in those circles. But where I see hope is actually at the congregational level. Probably in the last 2 years spoken to 60 or 70 congregations that are just saying, like, we want to figure this out. We want to do this work. We want to have this conversation. And I think that's what's new. In the civil rights era, I think what happened is that many denominations thought they were doing civil rights work by putting out press releases in their denominational offices. And that it sat up here. And if all you do is, if the only history you read are those statements that got put out by the United Methodists and even the Southern Baptists, in some cases, it looks like the rank and file, right, of all those white denominations were right in line. My favorite example is the Episcopal Church. They were key in inviting Martin Luther King to speak to the National Council of Churches, which was kind of a big move, in the 1960s, kind of early 1960s. That same year, an Episcopal school in Atlanta denied admission to his son on the basis of race. Right, so what's happening at the denominational level, what's happening at the local level, and so I think what's new is I do think there are enough local congregations that are really taking up this work, doing the work themselves, not relying on some materials from the denomination to fall down from on high, but really doing it, at the grassroots level. So I'm actually a little more hopeful. I turned in the manuscript for this last book in the fall of 2019, and I'm actually a little more hopeful now, believe it or not, than I was when I turned the manuscript in.
We need some hope. I'm glad that you're a little more hopeful now.
You mentioned the contrast of the warm feelings versus the kind of more holding the ideals of racism. I recently heard, I think a black podcaster, I don't remember which one, saying something like, white people like black culture but not black people. Just wondering if your research touched on any of that more specifically.
Yeah, we've done some. We're actually in the field next month updating the survey about the diversity of people's friendship networks. And so we still see, for example, very, very socially segregated friendship networks, right? So we still haven't penetrated. So when we ask, for example, the way we did this in the surveys, we asked people to name up to 7 people with whom they've had important conversations about their life in the last 12 months. So these are people not just that you pass on the street or see in the store, but who you really talk to, right? If you've got a problem, you got to work something out, you want some advice, real friends, right? The average white person's French core we kind of call that the core friendship network, is 93% white. And 3/4 of white people report no persons of color at all, in their friendship network. So I think we've not really done a decent job of kind of penetrating that. And on this other point, I do think that just to kind of hammer home this gap, because I do think it's about theology, and since we're in the theological seminary here, it is this hyper-individualist notion of salvation that is the real culprit, right? And again, the thing that's really important is this is no accident. Why do we have such an individualist notion of salvation that is so contradictory to the plain reading of the full text of the Bible? But we've developed this very hyper-individualistic way of thinking about salvation. That is, all the language we sung, and all those invitational hymns about Jesus coming into your heart, like all those metaphors that we use, it's a very kind of private, intimate kind of connection. But what does that do? It closes down the scope of Christianity, right? Again, it becomes, I'm certainly growing up. I mean, I did those quiet time journals and prayers and all that stuff, and those were all about like a hyper interrogation of, do I have sexually impure thoughts? Have I, lied? Have I cheated? There were all these kind of personal morality that you just anguished over. But almost none of those devotionals directed me to ask, why do all the black people in my town live over there, right? And why is the economic situation between the average African American in Mississippi so drastically different than the average white person? How do we get there? And what's that about? Just none of that, right, was there. And remember my elementary school was desegregated when I was in 3rd grade. 1976, 22 years after Brown v. Board of Education. What did my church have to say about that? Nada. Absolutely nothing, right? Because it wasn't about that individual relationship between me and a white Jesus. And so I think that we've just impoverished our theology in a way that blinds us, right, to these broader realities. And you think about theology as a lens on seeing the world, we have become quite myopic. And our theology has not accidentally done that. It has done that so that we could live guilt-free under the conditions of white supremacy.
This is a question about how racism may play out in different parts of the country. I heard a podcast that had characterizations of how white people in the South and their racism is different from white people in the North that have stuck with me. This is from the Seeing White podcast I listened to a few years ago. John Bewan, I believe, was the host, and Chinjarai Kumanika was a person who helped him kind of think through some of what he was finding. And the two characterizations were white people in the South don't mind if black people get close, they just don't want them too high. And in the North, they don't mind them getting too high, they might elect them for mayor, they just don't want them too close, they're not going to live next to them. And then the other characterization was that white people in the South love the people but hate the race. White people in the North love the race. They wouldn't fly a Confederate flag, for example, but they hate the people. And so I wonder, and again, those are just characterizations and maybe overgeneralized, but did you find in your research that there are differences depending on where you live, in how we might not see certain things?
No, it's a good question. It's really about region, culture, history, and certainly have different histories. Here's what's remarkable. In the quantitative data, you actually, once you control for region, you really don't see that many differences, right? So, and the way you do this is in statistical models, right? Is you are looking kind of to predict. I was looking to predict, for example, someone being a white Christian based on how many racist attitudes they held, right? And what's the relationship there? Once you control for region, that connection is just as strong. Basically throughout the country. And it's really notable, and it's true for white Catholics, it's true for white evangelical Protestants, it's true for white mainline or non-evangelical Protestants as well. I have to say, I'm always suspicious of those clever rhetorical turns of phrase. They almost never are that clean in the data like that. So you see some differences, but what's interesting is that this history, and again, I've just had to become, I was talking with Kristen Dumais, who's here, and someone whose work I deeply respect, about having to become kind of an amateur historian. I'm not trained as a historian, I'm trained as a sociologist, and so having to kind of learn that craft a bit because I needed it to explain the data that I was seeing in front of me. And the remarkable thing was that when you look regionally, so you can control for region, a lot of those differences actually disappear. If you control for region, another way to look at it is to look at it intra-region. And what happened when we looked at intra-region in the data is that while you found, for example, that the white evangelical churches weren't the carriers of racism in the Northeast, right? But you know who was the carriers of racist attitudes in white Christianity? Were Catholics in the Northeast. And white evangelicals weren't the carriers of kind of more racist attitudes in Minnesota, right? But who was? The mainline Protestants and mostly the Lutherans were in Minnesota, right? So it was interesting that you can, if you look within regions, that the strength of the correlation becomes stronger for Catholics in the Northeast. It becomes stronger for the mainline Protestants in the kind of Midwest, and it's the strongest for white evangelicals in the South. So all that is to say that what the data seems to indicate really in terms of religion and Christianity is that whatever the dominant kind of embodiment of white Christianity was in that region became the carrier of white supremacy. And if you think about it, so it became a kind of the moral justification for white supremacy in that region.
Good. And I think we may have time for one more question from the floor, if anybody has. Yes.
You talked about sort of white sense of innocence. What are communities doing to address issues of economic equity?
Yeah, so I'll start with this the church in Macon. It sort of began with a kind of better historical understanding of how they got to where they got. And then they began to notice, right, the white church has a much more prominent building, right, than the African American church does. The white church has a fairly large endowment. The African American church doesn't, right? And they're actually taking those questions up now and asking like, okay, well, we know how we got here now. We've done that work. What's our responsibility, right? And some sense of equity and knowing that some of the funds that are still sitting in the coffers of the predominantly white church, were earned on the labor of the people that were sitting in the other church, right? And they're still there today. So I think the equity question and the question of reparations actually has to happen. But we're only beginning. Going up to Tulsa, and what's remarkable about Tulsa is many of you may have covered it, or seen it last year. Whole city was involved, right? In this 100th anniversary, 100th commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Joe Biden shows up, right? Sitting president of the United States. Is actually the first time a sitting president of the United States has used the word white supremacy in a speech. Was Joe Biden's speech in Tulsa last year. names it, right? And it's all about telling the truth. And they, I think, did, from my perspective, a pretty decent job of telling the truth. What's remarkable is that in 1921, the week after those 300 African Americans are gunned down by their white neighbors, the mayor of Tulsa in 1921 gives, at a press conference, says, the city is at fault. We absolutely dropped the ball here, and we will repay every penny that was lost to the African American community in Tulsa. Says this at a national press conference. Now, why does he say that? Because the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the national papers and even some international papers were all over Tulsa, right? And he did that to kind of get them off his back. And you can guess how many of those 1 pennies have actually been paid in 2021, and that is 0. Right? But I think we were just at the beginning. But I think the word healing and the word repair, I talk a lot about repair here and not about reconciliation. This is the last point I'm making, and we're at time. But if there's anything, this is a great point to leave a kind of mostly white audience and at a mostly white institution here. I really think white Christians should stop talking about reconciliation. Just stop talking about it and just start talking about repair. Repairing the damage. It's monetary, it's other forms, but it is absolutely financial. And if we just focused on repairing the damage, I think my line on it is, look, our African American brothers and sisters, they're going to tell us when we're reconciled, right? The reconciliation will take care of itself if we do enough of the truth telling and the repair.
Honestly, if you ask me, I'll say that there's a big contradiction between racism and a person who consider themselves righteous, or let's say generally Christians. And in as much as they might have been Christians, but they still practice these things, there are a number of things which perpetuate these things to happen. So the first one that I'm going to read out is legacy of segregation. Many churches in the United States, particularly in the South, have historical ties to segregation and discriminatory practices. This history can influence or present attitudes and behaviors. And you also have cultural norms, because somebody might be going to the church but is still ingrained to their norms or culture, you know. So you're wondering, this is all maybe a preacher or somebody who is a father, or somebody who just has a name in the church, somebody so reputable in the church, but they still practice these things. So something which is ingrained in their cultural norm. I'm also going to talk about misinterpretation of the scripture, where we have the selective reading. Some individuals may selectively interpret or misinterpret biblical text to justify their prejudices. This can happen when people take verses out of context or ignore the overreaching message of love, equality, and justice. And this is something which has been happening because even in the Bible, it is written that something which is black is being associated with something which is evil, And come think about it. These are things which was written, these are things which was interpreted by people who are trusted and believed in the church. And so this type of interpretation might not even make sense to them or to some people. When they hear some black folks that want to come to church, I'm questioning myself, how deep was it those days when even a person could not get into a church to pray? Damn, that was so much, that was so much. Even in the church, come on, bro. That was so much. I'm also going to talk about church doctrines versus personal beliefs. There can be a disconnect between official church doctrine, which often preaches equality and love for all, and the personal beliefs of its members. Two people, church and its members. The church preaches ABCD, its members believe in ABCD, and that's also a problem. So you keep on asking yourself, why is it that people are going to the church at the same time they are racist? Because there's a thick line between the two. And you're trying to understand, why are these people trying to do this those days? Or why were they deleting black people who are trying to get to these churches. And I know that this topic is something which is not being talked about. And people gotta talk about it, People gotta get to know the truth, what happened in those days. I'm also going to talk about psychological factors which might lead some white folks or some people to be racist. Another thing, one psychological factor which might cause this to happen is what is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance theory suggests that people experience discomfort when their beliefs and actions are inconsistent. There is this keep on fighting. That's what we call the cognitive dissonance. You keep on fighting and your heart and soul, there's something you want, at the same time you don't want it. There's this some type of internal conflict that you have within yourself. To alleviate this discomfort, they might rationalize or deny their racist attitudes rather than comfort and change them. So I think, for example, this priest, he went through cognitive dissonance because when he was raised in a place where people used to practice such kind of things. So with that being said, it means that he sat somewhere and looked into it. Okay, my family have been practicing this. People have been practicing this in my environment. And what, for instance, me as a person, what can I do to change this? So when he decided that he's gonna sit down and find a way of changing the things which were happening during those days, these are some psychological, factors which force this. And one of them that I talked about is this cognitive dissonance. And I believe, and I'm glad that he fought and he went through it and he got to stand and preach the right way. And I'm so glad that finally people are coming out and the truth is being aired out there. And I usually say, the truth shall set you free. And that's what's happening. Another thing that I'll also discuss is the in-group bias as one of the psychological factors. We gotta say that psychological tendencies to favor one's own group over other can lead to prejudices. In some cases, church communities become insular, reinforcing in-group biases. For instance, when they when they are in a church, it's all about how do they behave as a group in the church. Sometimes it's not even about the church, but their particular group in the church. How do they behave, And if there are a group of people, for instance, during those times who are white, they might not want white people, even though they are preaching what's in the Bible, even though they are preaching what they consider to be righteous, even though they are preaching what it really means to be saved or to live righteously. But they still have this problem because it is called an in-group bias. That's one thing which they do have. So one of the things in which I've seen this preach come out do is addressing racism in churches, because you find that a large number of population of people who does this are the people who go to church. People consider themselves righteous. So I feel like the church is a good platform to always bring these talks, and it is true. It's a good platform to bring these talks, and it happened that also this talk was being heard in the church. So why is it addressing these issues in the church is important, One is the leadership and accountability. Pastoral leadership. Pastors and church leaders must take a strong stand against racism, preaching messages of inclusivity and equality. They should actively work to dismantle discriminatory practices within their congregation. It is your work as a preacher, whether black or white, to preach equality amongst people. Because today, it's not like in the past. In the past, we had people who, like the in-group bias. That's why we had the white churches and black people were being stopped at the door not to get in the church, and they were like, what's happening? So preaching equality to stand against racism is something which should be done in the churches today, so that the kids who are going to the Sunday school, so that their upbringing, it makes them learn that we are equal in the face of the God. Another thing is policies and actions. Churches should implement clear policies against discriminatory and actively promote diversity and inclusion within their leadership and congregation. Even if it's power dissemination in the church, let's give it 50-50, not from the priest to the deacon to the who are all white, and the remaining people maybe who have lower seats are black people. So even when trying to make policies and actions, the people who are put in power should also be balanced, because this is a replica of what we call equality. Still in the church, people need education and awareness. People need anti-racism training. Offering training and educational programs on racism and its impact can help congregants understand and confront their own biases. Train people, make them understand that ABCD is wrong. They need not to do things to other people, and ask them if things were reversed, will it be okay to them? That's one question that you also might have wanted to ask yourself. Another third important thing is the community engagement. Dialogue and reconciliation. Facilitating open and honest conversations about race within the church can help bridge divides and foster understanding. That's what I was trying to say. Dialogue and reconciliation. And I think this preacher, that's the same thing that he did. He came for a dialogue, and he was open, and he said things the way they are, even though they were ugly, and he said them, and he reconciled, and he came to peace with it, that okay, it is the people in the past that did it, but I chose another way, and it's right for me, and it serves me right, and I'm good with it, and I have peace with it. Another factor is partnership with diverse congregation. Building relationships within churches from different racial and ethnic backgrounds can promote unity and shared mission work. Yes. Partnership is something which is really, really important, because in the church, I know there are always a number of activities that people can do, like together. So having this program set makes people stick together, do these activities together, might foster unity amongst them. By general, it is human nature to interact through different things, and so when we have this programs set for them, it's easier for them to really get to participate in this, and with that, creating that bond relationship with whether white or black people. Another thing that I'd like to talk about now, this goes to personal, you as a person, is personal reflection and growth. You need to conduct what is called self-examination, encouraging congregants to examine their own acts and attitudes towards race, asking God for guidance and transformation. This is crucial. How does it call? Self-introspection. You conduct what is called a self-introspection. When you conduct a self-introspection, you get to know what's happening with you. You get to know you get to understand your own self. You get to know how do you behave in a given way, and this might also help you shed some biases when it comes to races that you might have towards a given group of people. Just to say. So with this being said, it means that you can get to understand yourself and accept some things. And call yourself out while doing bad things, and get in peace to know that at some point we are all equal, and you're no better than any other person. I understand that it is really, really troubling that racism can exist within church communities, and it's true. It's really, really troubling because it might leave you asking yourself questions. Why is this happening to churches where people believe that it should be the place which is so righteous, a place where these things should not be happening? But you come and see that this is the place that these things happen. So you need to ask yourself a number of questions. You question yourself, but I usually say that your consciousness as a person should help or guide you in a number of things that you do out there, you know. For me, I don't know. It's even hard to say because I'm not white. But if I could have been existing in those times, and if I could have been white, I think I would have done things differently. But also, I would like to point out that nobody's born racist. This is something that they found, and you can also get away from it, just the way this preacher did. He got away. He got away from it, and is now a free person, and he stands for the truth, and now he's free, and now he's preaching what people need to know. And I feel like that's just a good thing. And like I said before, these are the types of conversations that we need to have, especially in the church. Because it is so hypocritical that we are not talking about these things in the church. And look at one observation that I also have. People in that church never turned out. Like they never came out to listen to this talk. Maybe you can assume maybe they were busy, or maybe they were just uninterested, you know. Because come to think about it, not a lot of people always like the truth. The truth hurts, but that's just the truth, you know. So, and I'm glad that people are getting to come out, people are getting to talk about these issues. Because if we keep on keeping quiet about these things, it is so sad. It is so sad how systemic racism was even something which was happening in the church. The white supremacy is something which was happening in the church. And like, you ask yourself questions. If this is the church, what about the street? What about in the educational sector? How worse can it be? Because if this is just a church, how worse can it be for other segments, which these things were happening during those days, you know? So, I hope this video finds you well wherever you are. If you're watching this video for the first time, you can consider subscribing. Thumbs up, like the video, share it. Let people know the truth, the way this preacher came out and stated things the way they are. I hope to see you in my next video. If you haven't joined my membership, kindly consider joining my membership. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.